Thank you so much for joining us, Mark. It's such an absolute thrill to have you here. Firstly, you've spoken and written quite evocatively about climate change. I'm thinking in particular about a quite a haunting audio diary on your blog, the Tarago Diaries, reflecting on a trip up to Bendigo on a bushfire day. You
Yeah,
spoke of country towns monstered by clouds spewing impossible flames and lost houses and towns and animals screaming in the dark. I grew up on that Calder Freeway, the road you took out to Bendigo. I grew up in a town called Macedon, and the
yeah.
country you evoked is really familiar to me. And likewise, the conditions that you evoked, the hot, dry
Mm.
wind, the smoke in the air. Any kid growing up in a town like I did knows what a bushfire day feels like. And when I think about climate change, that's what I think about. For
Yeah.
you, what was your wake up moment for climate change?
Well, that particular weekend, there was a profound sense of foreboding, and it was in all the media as well. Like, it was quite a critical set of numbers, and everyone was talking about it. And the 2007 or 2008, whenever that massive fire happened in the northeast of Melbourne, was oddly enough, and the Hunters and Collectors did a relief concert for that as well, right back then. So it was kind of in our blood, I suppose. And I recollected a similar feeling. But look, I just like to say, I don't really feel that there's been any great epiphanies. I think I'm like a pretty typical member of the population that is had this dawning awareness, growing awareness over time that things aren't the way they were, and that the notion that weather is actually affecting us directly now is finally reaching a point where, well, people talk about, and scientists talk about tipping points and everything else, but I think the broader population don't really see it like that. And trying to encourage people to, I hate to use the word, but I will, lean in and actually go, well, you know what? This is, I have to own this, and as an individual, and really that meaningful political change can only occur when the greater good is accepted as part of the equation.
It's getting pretty hard to ignore the impacts of climate damage here in Australia, particularly over the last 12 months. We've seen terrible storms and floods all up the East Coast. Have
Mm.
you personally been affected by wild weather like this?
Well, there was that Bendigo story I wrote about. Real kicker was uh, what ended up interrupting the last major tour I was on with Hunters and Collectors before COVID. So it was kind of like this phenomenal meeting of naturally occurring disasters that happened over a very, very short period of time. But we actually had to drive into Batemans Bay from Canberra Airport, and then the tour stopped immediately after that. And we drove through the Alpine Ranges, just down on the eastern side of the New South Wales border to get to Batemans Bay. And it's like this really long descent out of the hills to get down to the coast. And the driving through that mountain road, there's only one way of doing it, right? And that sort of sometimes happens when you're touring, that you have to get to an airport and then you have to go to this, especially if it's regional. You might be 2 or 3 hours on the road getting to the gig. And that was like really confronting because, we'd gone in there just after the fires had gone through and you could smell it, and as far as we could see in any direction, you're on this mountain road and the hills are just rust, or black actually. And, a lot of those photographs were published subsequently to that cataclysm, but then the gig itself as well, like, playing in the dark just as the sun was going down, and there's just in this big football field and there's thousands of people in the community who've turned up, and, the palpable sense of relief that they were able to do this, they could actually come together and listen and celebrate music after this other thing had happened was deeply emotional. I mean, it was very, very powerful show. Like, it just felt really close.
Mm. What scares you about what's coming down the line for us?
Look, without risking cliche, but I do really feel for my children. They're young adults now, and they are going to be spending most of their lives in an environment where those challenges will have to be constantly met, you know, year in, year out until they die. That's the hard thing to accept. But at the same time, I'm really reluctant to feel intimidated by it. I think you've got to get above that, and you've got to actually go, well, it's kind of like accepting that our fate, we've drawn the lines of our own fate, and we have to actually grapple with it now. It's already here, obviously, and we have to actually be really proactive about in our consciousness of the environment and make choices we can afford to make, of course, in terms of our own behavior. And I don't see that we can do anything else, you know, and be courageous about that, you know.
Does that give you hope?
Oh, I always have hope, you know. I always have hope. I'd say I'm politically optimistic, you know? And I always feel that whenever there's, you know, I mean, I'm 66, so I've seen a lot of action in terms of Australian historical. I mean, I'm a student of politics. I love it, you know, but I always feel that there's a central place that the public get to ultimately, where they can see that they're, you know, the people they've voted for are operating in their best interests, and they adopt a position of faith. But they've got to get to that place, you know, where, you know, like we've got this 43% cap, and I think that will definitely change as a consequence of horse trading in the federal parliament. I think that is actually going to happen. And it's a very clever strategy that Albanese has adopted, because he's been a master of very little, but he's actually managed to play people off against each other. And now we're hopefully getting to a place where, as again, and the word hope just springs up, where that number will increase.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Mark. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Great to be here.